Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado, joined by David Drapkin. Just us today for this Solidarity Friday episode. And we're really excited because we get to dig into some really fun topics, revisit some old topics, and it's gonna be cool. So, David, how are things going in New Jersey?
They are good. Thanks, Joe. Lovely to be here. I developed a little bit of a sore throat yesterday, and I didn't know why until I kind of started to read the news. And it's because we had the worst air quality in the world, so worse than Peru, Lima, and Calcutta. And literally, New York, New Jersey had the worst air quality because of the fires from the west coming over. So we talk about climate change, climate crisis quite a bit here. I'm feeling it literally in my throat. And I don't know how things are over in Colorado, but
yeah. Not that long ago, I couldn't go outside without it smelling like a campfire. This is definitely very palpable smoke. Last summer, it was so bad that I just had like boiling water in the house just to take down the smoke particles. And it helped a lot, but it was still like really bad. My lungs weren't doing great with it. And I read a paper, or somebody sent me a paper a while back saying this is the worst drought conditions in 2,000 years in Colorado's geological history, right? So what does that mean? It means we're in deep. So hopefully I can ride out a few more seasons before I have to relocate on account of fires, but we'll see. So I feel it, it's close to my heart. We had record temps here, multiple days in a row, record temps. So I think we hit 88 for the first time in recorded history. Troubling. Yeah. I made a prediction a couple of years ago. If people wanted to like have a new cool business in Breckenridge, it would be air conditioners, like air conditioner installation. But, because it's such a cold town, nobody thinks about it.
I just spoke to my parents in England, there in Birmingham, and no one in England has an air conditioner or even a fan. Literally, you just open the window. No one and so they've had record heat in England as well. And so people so what do we do? Like they're looking up on Google, how do we cool our house down? So they're opening windows or closing curtains so the sun doesn't come through. And everyone's experiencing, like China, there's these floods right now. And the floods in Germany that just came through. These are once in a generation or once in every 100 years, happening more and more frequently. So it feels like now COVID's kind of moving through a new cycle. Mother Earth and kind of the oneness of the spirit of our universe is speaking to us and saying we kind of got to, really figure out a way through this.
Right. There's this writer, Michael Rupert, did a lot of really great thinking around these converging crises and what happens. And I won't insert it too much, but people should go check out some interviews with Michael Rupert around the climate thing and what happens when these, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 year events start happening every couple of years or every year or more, hurricanes, etc. So, all right. Let's dig in. So, first off, I was talking to somebody this morning about 5-MeO-DMT in Europe and toads and whatnot. And I'm like, you know what? I'm nervous about them being over-harvested on account of all the publicity with Mike Tyson and whatnot. And, all these new UFC fighters coming through. Synthetic only, please, if you even want to go there. But, in the desert, there's less rain. There's less toads. Dr. Andy Weil used to have them jumping into his house in southern Arizona. And now he just doesn't see them anymore. And it's been that way for years. Probably on account of development, changes in the atmosphere, a number of other factors like overharvesting. But, these things are delicate. Desert ecosystems are some of the most fragile ecosystems in the world. So we've got to be really careful. What happens when, what happens when your sacrament goes away? Perhaps protect your sacrament, if it's your sacrament, to the utmost. In the Catholic Church, you just make more wafers or wine, right? But it's a little different when it's in a really fragile ecosystem.
Yeah, and we talked about peyote a couple of weeks ago and how it was harvested traditionally as in a cultural rite of passage. And talking about the word sacrament, Joe, it makes me think of the word sacrifice as well. And in my Jewish tradition, that's a big part of what we used to do. And some chemical archaeologists recently found some cannabis-like residue on an altar in Israel from dated to around 2,000 years ago. So just the word sacrifice, and in relation to 5-MeO and peyote and climate change, and what can we do about these things where there is just simply not enough for 7.5 billion people to do what, well, ultimately they may want to do, but they're just, the answer is we have to make these sacrifices and say, I'm only going to use artificial 5-MeO if I've decided I want to do that. Or instead of having this peyote from here, I'm going to say, actually, no, I actually don't want to do that. And it's similar to being vegetarian or vegan and not, buying things from certain stores or websites saying, you know what, I don't feel comfortable with that. And it does make a mark. Some people think, what difference does that make? It's just a couple of pieces of cactus or, it really does make a difference collectively. And because we're talking about matters of the soul and of our consciousness, these decisions that we make kind of play into our experiences and our identity as well. So it's really important to align where our values are around these choices we make, around sacraments and sacrificing. Just so that they're here for generations to come.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. What if instead of monthly, you do it once every 5 years? Even just this veganism versus carnivore omnivore thing. It's a great analogy, David. So thanks for that. Perhaps there are medical benefits to eating certain kinds of meat, but is it worth it? And how do we make that decision? I was talking to somebody yesterday about some things, big picture thoughts. And it's as long as you're sitting with it and struggling, I think that's the thing of most primary import. How do we sit really uncomfortably with this really big thing and feel as much of it as we can and think about as much of it as we can before we make a decision? And perhaps that's the most important one. Important thing. Because I don't want to tell you what to do. I just, maybe be a little bit more careful, people.
Yeah. And you and I have been talking a little bit about IFS lately, and how we have these parts within us that are ours, and they're also our ancestors and our broader biological family and culture. And so, when we're feeling uncomfortable with a decision, it's because we've got different parts of us that are trying to figure out, so what do I actually do? What decision do I make if I've got this conflict? And if we repress that complexity to our decision making, we're not fully whole or fully present, or we're not feeling fully connected to who we are. So it's great to bring that piece in, that we should feel discomfort ultimately to then work through that.
Speaking of IFS, we didn't even plan this one, David, but Simon Ugler just published a blog on our site. What is depth psychology and how does it relate to psychedelics? I think he also published an IFS piece on our blog a while back. And I believe Tim Ferriss just retweeted. Let me actually pull up which specific one he retweeted. It's a big deal for us because 1.7 million followers on Twitter is a big deal. But I believe, it was another article, I believe, by Simon Ugler called Working with IFS, Therapy, and Psychedelics, Everything You Need to Know. So that came out in April. So it took a little bit for Tim to retweet that, but let's hope that some more in this series with Simon will get shared. Yeah.
Awesome news. Great.
Yeah. So IFS, it's a big deal. People should learn a little bit about it. It's, it's not essential, but it's a helpful and useful framework. As we say, a lot of these things are just helpful, useful frameworks until the next better one comes along. Right. Or we keep iterating All right. Well, let's dig into this first topic here. Do we want to start? Where do we want to start, David?
I think we had some updates on the one of the subjects we discussed last week, SB 519 in California.
Yeah, we got some feedback. Perhaps we were a little too negative on it. And perhaps we were a little undereducated as well. So, I'm still in support of SB 519. I think, there's going to be groups out there that fight for the perfect instead of what's the next adjacent possibility. And it's always going to be a conflict, right? I try to fight for that idealist position often, but I understand that to get there, we have to take a number of steps. And this is a massive project, and people's opinions on drugs are quite complicated, drugs and other psychedelic substances. And so let's talk about what this bill is. It's a bill that decriminalizes some psychedelics in some possession limits. Is that right? And in actual fact, makes for lawful possession and sharing in some cases, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, within certain kind of quantitative limits for each compound or substance. Yeah, and the piece that there was some perhaps confusion about last week was around this social sharing piece. I think we were under the impression that it was saying it was not allowed, and that perhaps that was a ploy or a way of streamlining it just to the kind of clinical sphere outside of the more communal, recreational, and kind of group sharing sphere of psychedelic use. But actually we had someone point us in the right direction and say that actually social sharing may well be allowed, and they use the terms if it's for facilitated or supported use, but we couldn't find those terms in the actual legal paperwork of the bill. But it does seem to be that there is some ability to share, I guess, if it's in a more intentional way, ultimately it's saying. But I think they're trying to get around the whole dealing aspect of it, that you just giving it around profusely, or, like in the 60s or 70s, how people were pouring LSD into the punch at parties. So that's not the kind of sharing that they want to happen. It needs to be a bit more intentional than that.
Yeah. Which I find interesting, right? Because it's ignoring large portions of the pre-existing psychedelic culture in the US. And, not all psychedelic culture is facilitated experiences, right? In fact, it's probably more on the margins of these experiences. Yeah. I'm actually searching the bill right now. And it's, it's interesting. Like, one thing I found really fascinating in there was that initially they wanted to essentially expunge and seal records of people who had convictions. And they actually pulled that from SB 519. And at first I was like a little flustered. And then I read further saying it was actually a really substantial expense, which could increase resistance in the Senate, because you can only pass so many things as a politician that cost money, right? You've got to make decisions, and it's hard. I don't want that job. I kind of have it here at Psychedelics. I think it's really hard at the California level. It'd be really, really hard.
Yeah.
But it makes sense that we could then do it later. Okay, now we've decriminalized. Let's get those people out of jail and expunge their records, seal their records, that kind of stuff. And I love that Scott Wiener is interested in that, and I love that this marijuana moment article by Kyle Jaeger actually kind of said that even the sitting governor in California is a longtime vocal critic of the drug war. So I found that really helpful.
Yeah, and it's great to review this again, because I got to be honest with you, I was feeling a wee bit disgruntled last week, Joe.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Because I was thinking to myself, well, hang on, I just read that same article and I was feeling pretty bloody happy about that. Like, I was thinking, oh, this is great. This is just what we need. But maybe I didn't look at the small print, or maybe I'm just not as, burnt out, because I haven't been working in this field for so long. I'm coming from mainstream mental health and addiction treatment. So to look at these bills and the book by Michael Pollan, to be honest, I was thinking, God, isn't this great? And I'm a little bit that personality. I get excited by things quite easily. But at the same time, I thought a bit more about this over the last week. And, we spoke about it as well, Joe. And I really think deep down, there's a part of us in this community that want to see positive change on the legal policy level. We are a disgruntled minority. There's a lot of cynicism. There's a lot of fear as well. There's also a lot of anger as well that I think we all feel. And to some extent, some of us need to hide certain things publicly and privately. So all of these kind of complex intersectionalities around, our identity, our experience, and our hopes and wishes for what happens in America right now around drug policy reform, it's very hard to express that in a clean way. It makes it hard as well, I think, to form partnerships. So I think what's happening in California is great, because it's they are pioneering it. Like this is, they and others, some of the first few, in Colorado too, some of the first few states to really test the waters. And this may not work in California. It may, I was just reading the Republicans, it seems, are quite unanimous against it. And the Democrats are not necessarily unanimous for it, in which case it won't be approved. So this is tenuous. And so it brings up this question. I'm not sure if I can express it, but that there's a part about being a minority where we have a choice. Do I stand my ground? And do I insist on getting everything that I deserve, on insisting on the change that is right and the change that is needed, that we all know is what we deserve? Or do we make these kind of political deals and compromises and concessions and sacrifices again, just because it's a step in the right direction? And we want to step into our power as well, not just be that kind of weak minority. We're actually stepping into our power as people with lived experience and wisdom and knowledge, and with an important part of wanting to work with others to help them appreciate our perspective. And you know what? I'll also try and appreciate their perspective too, about why they don't want to, what are they worried about? And I guess that's why they've put some compromises in around taking out ketamine, for example, and adding in the quantity limits and this, qualification around social sharing. That's because we're understanding their narrative and hopefully they're understanding ours. And it's going to get us to where we want to eventually, I hope, but there's no guarantee. But hopefully it will. So we're kind of putting our trust in uncertainty.
Right. In this psychedelic policy reform thing and the drug policy reform or reform world generally, we have a lot of we've got a lot of biases that we don't really understand and how those relate to the larger culture. So we're a huge minority. The drug war was wildly successful in doing what it wanted to do, and we're still recovering from that. And we've got a long way to go. But I think I forget regularly that I'm such a minority in my views. Like I'm not really even that congruent with psychedelic culture at large, right? Kind of an outlier in like how aggressive my drug policy reform agenda is. And, my own personal use cases are very outside the scope of what, most people would call traditional psychedelic culture. Yeah. So I don't know, like I've got blinders on, but I think you're spot on here in that we need to figure out how to be politically effective, because this is a political problem, unless we just totally opt out and say, I'm doing my own thing. Politics don't matter, whatever. See you later. Doesn't mean they still can't put you in jail. Or you can catch a stray bullet from a DEA agent or something after your, illegal church service or whatever it is. There's a lot of wacky stuff here. And we need to be realists at the same time as idealists. That's my read. So what's the next practical step to get us towards what we think is right? And Michael Pollan's book was part of that. And I have issues with him, but, largely his book was probably the turning point for our movement. So, I'm thankful for that. Like when How to Change Your Mind came out, it changed everything. And it continued to change everything for the next years after. People are still reading it today and getting really excited. So, it's an artifact that's done a lot of good. It's also created a lot of biases and blind spots, but what kind of a compelling narrative that would sell gazillions of copies could be totally inclusive of all stories? You can't. He certainly missed some things with Maria Sabina and some women in the movement that were really important, but that's probably would have been the easiest fix. But this would take like 7 volumes, like 7 different 500-page books to like really kind of tell this story skillfully. And that even wouldn't be complete, right? Because each individual story requires its own book. Yeah.
It's really interesting talking about what we're advocating for here, as a story with chapters, because I feel like as a historical narrative, the arc of history, where have we been the last 60 years around drug policy, 70 years, and each decade or, each year has kind of been moving through a different chapter, a different kind of narrative about what's right, and what is the problem, what is the solution here. And, traditionally, we're coming from a place of prohibition where psychedelics were the problem. And now it seems to be that actually, oh boy, psychedelics seem to be the solution for a lot of mental health and addiction disorders, as well as just general well-being, which we're going to talk about shortly in one of our articles. So, the arc of history and the narrative is changing. And so what we're trying to do is just bump it, just move that needle. And if we can, I guess if you think about a needle, how you just need to move it by like 1 degree. So that exponentially in a couple of decades, whoa, look at that difference that made.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. Like, it's a slow march, but it is a march, and we're making progress. And SB519 is no different. It's definitely part of this. And your comments here about cynical, like we can get really cynical because we're like, okay, like apparently some people are going to be in jail forever for nonviolent offenses. Like Ross Ulrich, the guy that made Silk Road, 2 life sentences. Not a violent offender. He made websites. And that's what he was sentenced for. Like there's all sorts of stories about him hiring hitmen, but there's zero evidence whatsoever. And just reading the books, you're like, oh, like nobody actually died in this story. And so, how do we have faith in an institution that's in all these various institutions that have done so much really gross stuff, and continue to participate in this democracy that doesn't feel that way sometimes? And that's the cynicism that I feel regularly. But then I go, okay, like, yeah, I can feel cynical, but the only way to make a change is to be involved. And, SB519, Scott Wiener, it's a great project, really great project. And, Decriminalized Nature started yelling a little bit about the possession limits, saying like, oh, you're just like looking for an arbitrary number at which you could put somebody in prison. I'm like, well, let's look at these numbers here. 2 grams of DMT, 15 grams of Ibogaine, 0.01 grams of LSD. It's an enormous amount of LSD. 4 grams of mescaline, 2 grams of pure psilocybin, or 4 ounces of fungi. It's a ton. 2 grams of psilocin. It's amazing. Or 4 ounces of mushrooms. And then 4 grams of MDMA. Those possession limits are awesome. Like I would never exceed those limits, even if I was doing this in a religious capacity or a, kind of facilitated capacity. Like that's an incredible amount of substance to be carrying.
Interesting. So when, it's actually fairly progressive, or, it's that's sufficient on that level for the vast majority of what circumstances it would be used for. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And then, what did we get here? They want to Decrim Nature wants to actually park the bill and spend a few more months on it to get it right. And, there's some interesting things in here about, Peter Thiel's privateer group being involved in one of the nonprofits pushing this. Find that really interesting. And some of the Facebook gazillionaires are getting involved. And that's all in this Marijuana Moment article. So, is there a for-profit play going here? Maybe, I think is the answer.
Yeah.
This doesn't seem as aggressive as some of the stuff we saw in cannabis, where it was like, essentially maybe 10 or 20 super rich people got exclusive licenses or were going to get exclusive licenses in the state and nobody else could jump in. So essentially totally locking down the market. Small players couldn't enter. And I don't see that here yet. I am a little concerned about this whole thing of we've got to do it in a facilitated context. And, Michelle and I got into that a little bit. Like, what if somebody wants to go in the woods and that's their way of doing it, and that's the way they've always done it, and that they don't feel safe with a facilitator? Carl Hart said at one point, I find the concept of a sitter hiring a pro to like watch me do drugs creepy. A lot of us have very different relationships to this stuff and have been coming from really different places in our personal lives. And, how do we make this inclusive? Like I knew a woman, dated this woman way back who grew up Abenaki, which is a relatively endangered Native American group. I don't know if they got federal recognition yet. They weren't really recognized as a tribe, so they didn't get all the. I think the government recognized them as extinct, so they didn't get like the same kind of benefits a lot of the other indigenous groups got. But anyway, they had this practice of it's kind of coming of age ritual where you would get buried up to your neck in the woods overnight.
Right.
And that's solo. There's no sitter there other than great spirit,
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's definitely that aspect to what we're talking about, is that more unstructured rite of passage, vision quest kind of way that psychedelics can be used, potentially in a tribal, communal, kind of indigenous way, which is totally different to being in a clinical environment, like that kind of hygienic, sanitized, pathological model of psychedelic use, which is really just coming from that Western space.
Right. There's this like a traditional, say Friedrich Nietzsche kind of had this Apollonian versus the Dionysian, covered quite a bit. Apollonian being kind of like, solar, moon, like order, the Dionysian being like really chaotic. And these are like the two kind of big aspects of the human spirit and soul. Yeah. And the ecstatic rites all over Greece and ancient Greece, that was a big deal. It plays a big part in Greek myth. But also the structured, like really somber kind of stuff being really important as well. Yeah. And so are we totally ignoring huge swaths of the human spirit? And I think yes.
Swaths.
So, and I had this funny shower thought the other day, David. So
tell me about it, Joe.
And it's relevant,
okay.
I promise. And it's a normal talk track for me too, so it's not really that novel. But this idea that what is colonialism? Is the psychedelic culture being colonized by medicine and other kind of for-profit groups? Because this isn't purely a medical project, right? It's a lot more than that. And what happened to the people that were here before? I would say this whole thing started when Doblin really got rolling. That's kind of like this new era of the psychedelic project. And there was people doing this for decades before that. And are they being included? There's people using these substances. I'm not talking about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. I'm talking about having, primary experiences. They're having their own experiences with this stuff, be it in the woods, in the jungle, in the ocean, Esalen, or at a Grateful Dead show. Like how much LSD has been consumed, how many lessons learned through this whole hippie movement that are now being included in the psychedelic movement more broadly. And we're ignoring that huge amounts of Americans and Europeans consumed psychedelics for a long period of time and fed back their data into what's now being called this new psychedelic renaissance. And, because this is, a big portion of where I live is this live music kind of scene. And like it's music, people can kind of think is cheap, but music is really, really important to the human mind, I think, and soul. Large portions of it. There's certainly big portions of people who don't really get music, don't really like music, and it's probably a weird social anxiety situation there.
Yeah.
I mean, disjunct from culture, but how do we think about this more honestly and genuinely? Because I feel excluded all the time. Like I don't really feel part of the culture, even though I'm kind of a pseudo leader. Mm-hmm. Like I don't feel like I'm part of this scene in a lot of ways, and partly by design, but partly because I just don't really dig the ideology sometimes.
Yeah. So we were talking about a minority collectively and, individually as well. And there's that kind of idea of minority stress. And if you're feeling as you're taking a shower that there's like a like an empire, imperial force about to colonize, what is something we, very tenderly, love and respect and nurture. And we feel like we're doing so in unison with people that have inhabited our planet before it was covered in concrete and Wi-Fi signals and, satellites with weaponized drones. Then, we're part of this movement that is connected to ancestors of many generations and potentially beyond just this planet to other dimensions of universes. So I won't go into that too much, but thanks for sharing that thought. It does feel like there's this hyper-capitalistic monstrosity that kind of eats things up, and it needs to, because it's extractive and it needs fuel in order to grow, to get kind of dividends for the shareholders or kind of GDP, to keep the lights on, on a national economy, and for VC money to keep pouring in. But actually, do we need all of that? The answer is both. No, because this has been going on for hundreds and thousands of years without all of that stuff happening. But we seem to now have in this hyper-capitalist society more mental health problems than we've ever experienced before, and more environmental problems than we've ever experienced before. And potentially we need almost like if capitalism can be used in its meeting point with psychedelics, to create a model that enables mass scaling and safe, responsible use and accessibility to psychedelics because of the mass scale of mental illness and a kind of ontological crisis and desperation. Well, okay, then maybe that's a pill worth taking, because boy, do we need something right now that's not just, a Xanax, or a Prozac or a 45-minute talk session. We need more than that on a individual and societal level. So I'd be willing to kind of dance with the devil of hypercapitalism if it actually enables that kind of merging of minds to happen. But as a minority, without the money, without the media, although we are a media company, so there you go, let's keep it. Our voice does need to be heard, and we want to express those voices of the minority. And a big part of what Michelle was saying last week is some of what's happening in SB 519, some of what is expressed in the Michael Pollan narrative of that kind of privileged white male voice isn't inclusive enough of our actual diversity globally speaking, but especially here in America. So policy and law needs to really inculcate the gamut of diversity when it comes to race, ethnicity, religion, sex, and gender identity. And so that's a really important part of what needs to be built into these laws.
So you mentioned something around, like how do we include this globally? And I had this thought, and it relates to, culture and cultural health. What does it mean that third world countries get better results from psychiatric meds treating schizophrenia? Have we thought about this long and hard? People need to be on the meds a lot shorter period of time. Is it that the human organism is more optimized for third world conditions or something? I don't know. So it's probably a shitty thing to say, but because I want hot running water, please. I kind of think that's essential these days for me. But what is it about first world culture that does that? And I think that's a really important question to ask. And the psychedelic discussion can help develop that angle. And then the other part, I was going off of my kind of live music, Grateful Dead thing and LSD culture. And we're the inheritors of all of it. We've inherited all of history. We're all the descendants of successful tribes. And we've got a vast history behind us, all of us. It theoretically converges at some point in the past. And we inherit all of it. And this is from the Alfred North Whitehead process philosophy perspective. He's got a whole framework worked out with physics, like showing how the past informs the collective unconscious is one way of looking at it. I'm sure he's got a different frame for that. But it's, the past is available to us. Everything that's past is available to us in this current moment. And it's kind of this Spinoza kind of monadology thing of, everything is in this one egg. And Whitehead modernized it by giving it windows we can actually look in. Spinoza's you couldn't really look in or out. But now we can look in and out. And there's a good philosophical frame for that. Yeah. It's a fun one. It's an interesting one. So largely we're not in disagreement. It's just this this idea that we need to let's hear each other out more often. There's this Terence McKenna quote I actually just shared on my Instagram today, and it talks about communication and kind of like I think there's probably like an end times angle that he wanted to put in there. Hold on here. But it's something around like, are we going to be able to continue communicating? Like, and what happens when communication breaks down for good? Are we in deep trouble? Here it goes. If anything undoes us, this will be it. That our languages fail, that we misread each other's intent, that we could not understand each other. I was having an argument with somebody yesterday about the vaccination, and the comments I were getting back were a little snarky, and it's like, like you're clearly clever, and you're pulling nice little sound bites out of these articles you read, but is it holistically informed? Does it think about how many people could die and have died? And how many doctors have you spoken with? How many virologists have you discussed this with, or vaccine developers even? Like I have a friend who had 24 people a week dying on her floor at the hospital, and she was seeing multiple generations of Navajo die in her same ward. The kids would come visit, they would get sick and die. The grandparents would get sick and die. And it's like, what are we doing here, and how does this work? And how do we deal with this sadness? Do we just deal with it with snark and cynicism? Or do we try to understand the collective and how we're in this together? We're on one spaceship, flying through Earth, or flying through space at an incredible rate. And are we going to make it? And perhaps cooperation matters. Perhaps language and intent of our language matters. So I was thinking this in like a bipartisan context. Like, do we actually understand somebody's intent? Like maybe they're saying some things that are inflammatory, but what are they really trying to do? Yeah. And maybe we need to understand that for ourselves too. What are we actually trying to communicate? And maybe what's the best way to communicate that, as opposed to trying to talk like the people from TV?
Yeah. And I'd ask a big question. I love what you're saying here, Joe. Significantly with communication, we tend to ignore or dismiss the power of listening. And when we think about communication, we think it's just talking. And so we often have to defend ourselves. We often have to be right. And we use our words to convince somebody of that. But actually, we don't have to be right. I love it. Like I like to show people I'm clever and I'm spiritual and I'm deep and I'm all of these things that I'm probably insecure about. But ultimately, what I really love doing is listening. Like you were saying, listening to music, but listening to a plethora and diversity of people. Traveling around the world is something that makes it very hard to not realize the importance of different opinions and different realities of different cultures. And I always encourage people to travel the world. And I believe that some people speak of traveling through worlds when using psychedelics. Yep. And that kind of unitary consciousness and oneness of being. And I think ultimately that's what we're trying to get to, more so from listening and being, because that helps us to be centered to that still place inside of ourselves and to see someone, in the eyes and see that we're not actually that different, especially like you were just saying, Joe. We are all descendants of humans that were here tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Every human being in the world, 7.6 billion of us, we're all family from these people that were around tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago. our ancestors didn't die, therefore we're still here. And there's just a lot of us, and we all look a bit different.
There's a character in the psychedelic scene, kind of a Voldemort type, who shall not be named. And clever line though. The idea that psychedelics can uncover vast unexplored continents, and many, many, many of them. And there's a lot left to do, and we, don't need to burn much fossil fuels to do it either. So a lot of room left, a lot of territory left. And how do we be inclusive and tolerant? I struggle with tolerance, as many of us probably do. But David, I want to transition into this next part about weirdness, or whichever one you want to pick first. I'll let you make the decision here.
Well, I'm going to go with weirdness because I'm going to try and go against my Virgoan kind of proclivity to stick to the agenda, which was to do the well-being article first. So I'm going to embrace just going with the flow. So that weirdness article.
I think it works because we're pretty far out already right now in this conversation. So it's pretty good. So what was the title of that article?
Working with Weirdness, a response to moving past mysticism in psychedelic science, by Joost Brixema and Michael van Elk.
Yeah. So you did a great job dissecting this thing. And I don't know, do you want to start with your personal experience, weave it in later? Or how do you want to dig in here?
Sure. Let's dig in with an overview of the article. So really what this is, it's a critique by academics about academics. So it's a response by the authors to another article and perception by two other people called Sanders and Zigelman, that's saying that this concept of mystical experience isn't valid. It's not scientific enough or rigorous enough. And really we should try and find a way to develop research protocols and to understand the potential of psychedelics that negates mystical experiences and that kind of term. And so it got me thinking about my own mystical experiences. I've had a few, to be honest, and there's three perhaps that I'll weave into one narrative. Mystical experiences seem to be this very powerful indicator, a variable, empirically speaking, of positive outcomes from psychedelic experiences. I think there's a correlation of about 60% from what I remember. I believe that Ingmar Gorman mentioned to me. So there's a very strong correlation between them, not necessarily causation. And in my own life, I can think back to, mystical experiences I had when I was, I think the first, I had two within a couple of weeks of each other, actually. I was 21 years old in Nottingham University, studying for economics exam in my cold bedroom, turned on my electric space heater. Lo and behold, it wasn't working, and it actually decided to electrocute me for about 15 seconds. So there I was holding this big space heater made in the 1970s. And I couldn't drop it because it was stuck to me because, the electricity just made a circuit from my left hand through my heart, down through my right hand, back into the heater like a circle. And at some point, I was screaming like I've never screamed before. At some point, a voice inside me said, as I felt my veins and my heart kind of filling up with electricity about to burst, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. And then I tried to drop it. And then the voice said, stop fighting it. You're dead. It's too late. And then the second that voice said it to me, I took a breath, and then the space heater exploded in literally very dramatic sparks and flames and smoke.
Oh my goodness.
And then flew itself to the other side of the room, made a big dent in the wall. And I'm just there. And I was wearing my Chuck Taylor Converse sneakers, trainers as we call them in England. And they literally saved my life, the doctor said, because they've got that nice big fat wedge of rubber on the bottom. And my life changed after that moment. So at that time, before the shock, I was the president of the University Economic Society, going to go into investment banking, mergers and acquisitions, had a big share portfolio that I got for my bar mitzvah. And at that point, I shaved my hair, became Buddhist and vegetarian, and got into social work and traveling the world and spiritual life. And then very interestingly, 2 weeks later, I only put this together recently that the two things coincided. I went to Amsterdam for the first time. And I happened to, because it's legal there, because obviously as a 21-year-old, I'm very careful about only doing things that are legal. So I went to Amsterdam and did partake of some cannabis intoxication, and also bought a box of, I think it was Mexican, they were just labeled Mexican mushrooms. And with my friends that we were in a coffee shop, didn't really know how much to take, didn't really know what they were, didn't know what to expect, never had them before. And I had my first experience of madness. And I've had quite a few experiences of madness, and I use the
psychotomimetic.
Yeah. I use the term loosely, but it's something that I'm comfortable with in my life arc. And so that taught me something about the power of psychedelics, and kind of, I literally found my mind in a vision that I was having, being on a precipice of a cliff face that down beneath me was complete madness that I would never come out of. Like it was a fiery pit, and I was looking into it, and literally I felt my mind teetering, kind of, will he or won't he kind of fall down that precipice. And that was hugely powerful for me. Like it taught me a respect of my mind, and how to be a bit more intentional about things. And I've used mindfulness meditation and journal writing all my life as a way of kind of checking in with my mental well-being. And then there was another experience I had that I deemed to be a mystical experience when I was in India for 6 months. I did a 10-day solitary silent retreat, and I was going walking in the mountains in Maharashtra near Pune, and on my way out there was a woman having an exorcism. And so there was the local shaman or elder and then 2 other family members around her. And they were kind of shaking her and chanting and drumming, and then she smashed some coconuts on the ground around her that seemed to signify the releasing of the evil spirit that was within her. And I carried on walking, and off I went up the hill as the sun set, and I heard a voice say, David, go to Israel. I was like, what? I'm in India. And literally it was a voice that, it didn't seem like it was inside my head. It just called out to me, go to Israel. And I was like, what? I'm Buddhist. I'm doing a Buddhist meditation retreat in India. And it took me 5 years to actually move to Israel. And I ended up going to New Zealand after India and becoming a resident there. But 5 years later, I did go to Israel. And that started my journey of kind of becoming, a Jewish man once again, as I have always been, as my ancestors have walked for thousands of years. So it took that mystical experience, perhaps somehow just witnessing that exorcism that opened me up, or perhaps there was some kind of spiritual energy that flowed through me, perhaps. So for me, that the value of mystical experience is they are an inherently important part of psychedelic therapy, psychedelic healing. And so what the authors are saying here is we need to include them in our understanding, just as, there is a movement within psychedelic research to try and get rid of the hallucinatory or the psychedelic aspect, and maybe just focus on the neurogenesis, the neuroplasticity piece of taking these medicines, and perhaps we can synthesize a psychedelic molecule so that it doesn't have any mystical experience or any hallucinatory psychedelic experience. Or maybe it shouldn't be 6 hours, it should just be 2 hours. And there's definitely advantages to having a 2-hour trip for some people. But there's also something that happens when it's 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, and there's a lot of material that comes up, a lot of traveling on spiritual realms, that it is a mystical experience that we need to allow to happen and give respect to, and perhaps try to model into our research.
Right. And somebody that's really important to history of psychology, Abraham Maslow, co-founded transpersonal psychology to help us include this stuff. Because humanistic psychology is a little secular. And how do we include the transcendent and the highly weird a little bit better than the old model did? I like the point here about psychedelics being fundamentally different to standard psychopharmacology. We're looking at very different stuff. Like this biochemical model has been kind of outdated, right? Like we kind of don't really believe chemical imbalance anymore in the same way we did 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's been quite invalidated, I believe. So how do we go further? And how do we include these new drugs and understand how the older generation drugs worked? Yeah. And I like this point too. Like, people are using psychedelics on their own outside of any kind of supervised prescription context to deal with all sorts of illnesses. Wouldn't it be great if doctors could speak honestly and openly to them? And what is the role of the doctor, therapist, psychiatrist here when people are doing it, taking their care into their own hands? I think it's a really big thing, and assuming the trend is actually helpful, we're going to see this continue to grow, and we've got to really pay attention to that. And it's a weird deal, right? Yeah. Like, all of a sudden everybody's drinking coffee and it's great for them. Like, how to, shut down the coffee houses. They're getting a little too political here. Like, coffee was a really political issue. It caused a number of revolutions because people could sit down and talk for hours and be really rational. So these psychedelics are doing something very different. It's like, okay, there's this really interesting new irrational space that's quite experiential and big. And I was heartened yesterday to hear Robin Carhart Harris in that panel I was on. Kind of, I think this was in the breakout room. Kind of say, we as scientists get a little too biased that like our little slice of the thing is the real thing, and we've got to figure out how we can be a little bit more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary maybe.
That's transdiagnostic, transdisciplinary, as well as including kind of religion, spirituality, mysticism, with science as well. And I have to say, Joe, I love that you mentioned yesterday. So kudos to you, brother. That was amazing. Tell us who you had in your room that you were moderating yesterday. That was quite a panel.
So this is at SciTech Global Summit yesterday. So that was July 20. Early in the morning, didn't sleep the night before. On the panel is Rick Doblin, Robin Carhart Harris, Matthew Johnson from Hopkins, and Rachel Yehuda. And she's essentially like the probably leading expert in PTSD research. And she's at Mount Sinai. She's got some affiliation with Compass, I think. And this is a stellar panel, like probably smartest people I've been in a room talking to at the same time. And it was fun. It was really nerve-wracking going into it, but then I'm like, wow, I just kind of wing everything in my life. So let's just do this and hopefully it works. Prepped for 20 minutes. And I wish I prepped for a few weeks, but it still worked out great and I loved it. And a friend took us a few screenshots. You took some great screenshots, but a friend took some, I think, Court, and he caught everybody laughing and me with like a smug grin. I kept trying to throw in little small zingers, and it was nice.
It was great. And it was lovely to see how there was a sense of collegiality there. They were working with different universities or funders and different projects, but they're all trying to do the same thing there. And Robin Carhart Harris seemed to have quite a lot of humility there. And, we're going to talk about his article next, but, just his concepts that, he's famous for, in what he's writing about. And coming back to this article about the mystical experience, isn't what we're trying to do with understanding and utilizing the uniqueness of psychedelic medicine, isn't it particularly unique in that it helps us get out of our usual default mode network? And fundamentally, I think that's part of what the mystical experience does. It can do something that really no other medicine can do. It's moving more into that mystical, spiritual, ontological space. And that's why, as they rightfully say in this article, the psychedelic therapy does create an ontological shock. And that can be really powerful for breakthroughs and transcendence, ego dissolution. But it can also be really helpful for people that are going through end-of-life anxiety, depression, or substance use disorders. So there's something about that mystical experience that actually quite a lot of the research is showing is particularly well indicated for certain people. I won't, and I've got a very close friend of mine back home in the UK unfortunately got diagnosed with cancer a week ago, and he is wrought with end-of-life anxiety. Thank God his prognosis has improved, and so he has been looking at is psychedelic therapy an option here, and because there's something about just standard antidepressants and talk therapy that hasn't really worked or doesn't really appeal to what people need. So I think this mystical experience, it's valid, and it's really, really important to include here. And it's not just like they use the words, researchers tend to think about this neurobiological explanation only. It's more kind of materialist and reductionist. And so that's why, I think we tend to rely a little bit too much on this pathological model that uses scaling questionnaires like PHQ-9s that are very relevant, yeah, but there's also things called the Hood Mysticism Scale. Give me some of that, or the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which is, very well respected, the Ego Dissolution Inventory, and the 5 Dimensions of Altered States of Consciousness Scale. So they're very, very powerful ways of measuring people's experiences and hopefully determining some form of correlation.
Right. Yeah. And it's going to be a different kind of science. It's going to be a different kind of psychology, and it's going to be a little hard and bumpy as we kind of land into this territory. But we can do it.
Yeah.
We've done weirder. We made it this far into evolution, gone through some really strange times. So I think we can include the weirdness. Yeah. Eric Davis a year or two ago said, what's going to really freak these people out is when God keeps coming into the therapy room. Kyle and I share a story of a friend who was trying to unpack a mystical psychedelic experience she had with a therapist affiliated with the NYU program. And they were just not, they were trying to reduce the mystical to biographical, like make the mystical Freudian. And it's like, what? That doesn't make sense to me. To me, that deflates the therapeutic alliance and much more. I mean, Kyle and I probably beat that story to death on the show, but I think it's an important one. Even really highly trained people with really great credentials can make these problems.
And you also mentioned before we press record, a friend of yours who had 2 mystical experiences of the same nature that perhaps led him to change his life path.
Yeah, let me dig into that. So this person, a good friend of mine from back home, I believe was struck by lightning, not once, but twice. Survived. Wow. As far as I could tell, no major long-lasting injury. Really nice guy, great community member, really involved in all sorts of cool stuff, and became a priest in an esoteric Christian group. One somewhat affiliated with like magic and, Freemasonry, all that kind of weird stuff. And, that's why I was involved. But it's interesting to see that people can have these extreme states. Electricity, like who knew, could possibly send somebody on a very, very, very spiritual path. And as far as I know, no psychedelic use whatsoever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I think what we experience in our contemporary society is an ostracism of mystical nature and our inherent spiritual truth, I believe. And we experience that in all dimensions of life. It's like something we just don't talk about really. But it's actually a fundamental part of who we are. And when we go through existential crisis like we are right now, God, we need to really be able to talk about these things, both on the crisis level as well as a resolution level, that we have deep mystical, ontological, spiritual meaning, each of us inherently within us, and as a society and as a planet in a universe that is hundreds of millions of light years big. These mystical truths, I believe they're potentially part of how we can get ourselves out of the mess that we've got ourselves into. So if we try and just ostracize them, I don't know. I can't see a way of us getting around this just from policy and law and talk and the United Nations and things like that. I don't see a way to still be here in 100 years, let alone 200 years.
Right.
Unless we all want to hitchhike to Mars with who's the latest billionaire? Jeff Bezos. He went this week. So who's the latest billionaire this week to fly to into outer space? Oh, okay. This week it's Jeff Bezos. Last week it was
it's so funny how
Elon
closely
Musk.
together they all did it.
Yeah.
It's almost a cartoon.
Yep.
So, keep your eye on the prize, folks. That's just 3 individuals. There's a lot more bad guys than that out there. And we got a big project ahead of us. Just survival oriented, including psychedelics and culture, all this fun stuff. So yeah, William James was in this article, and that's nice for me to hear, because he's in our tradition. No psychology is complete that excludes certain experiences, certain mind states. And if this is just a constant talk track for me, right? We get a little myopic on, what are 80% of the experiences, and let's make our science around that. Wouldn't it be, a little bit more of a complete science if we included all of it? And, we're getting there, but we still got some work to do here. How much time has really been spent studying enlightenment from cross tradition enlightenment? What does a super wise rabbi look like in an MRI relative to a lama? There's so much wisdom in Judaism that we don't even talk about, right? And, I talk about Kabbalah a bunch. I'm kind of a dilettante there, but
cool.
I think there's something to know about it that it, in a lot of ways, is the yoga of the West. And it has been seen that way in many groups, including Christian groups that kind of adopted it. And do you ever see the movie Pi?
Oh my God. Yeah. That blew my mind.
Yeah. It's a nightmare, but it's fascinating.
Cause I'm going to disclose quite a bit here. So, I have OCD as well, Joe. I think I've mentioned it. So I have a similar kind of lived experience to the character of that film with internalized, repetitive, numbers and word letter combinations, probably thousands of times a day, and I've learned to kind of live with it. But sometimes I can get stuck down a wormhole. So it was such a powerful film, and he did that other film that was also incredibly powerful, more around kind of sex trafficking. But yeah, I think Kabbalah's phenomenal. I didn't know you were so into it, Joe. So perhaps that's our next Psychedelics Today course we build out. I'd love to do it.
Psychedelics and Kabbalah. There's this book, the guy that came out Tuesday, Daniel Muller. Yeah. His book was Shamanic Kabbalah. So he's trying to merge the Kabbalistic traditions into his own practice of kind of Amazonian shamanism.
Yeah, I think anything that points to a oneness of being, and that we are all blessed to be here, and that there is a connection to ancestors, and we're not just of this body. Those are the fundamental parts. And so you mentioned William James, Joe. I wanted to just pull up the brief definition they put in this article that we're referencing. They said, according to William James, mystical experiences are noetic, imparting important knowledge or insight. They're transient. They're experienced directly and subjectively, and are characterized by ineffability. So James compared this to describing the experience of love or music to someone who has experienced neither. So if you've got a scientist who's trying to validate and measure noetic, transient, ineffable experiences, how the bloody hell are they going to measure that and then build their algorithm and formula and hypothesis around it? Well, they've got some of those, mystical experience scales, etc., and they are, useful. But perhaps there's some other ways that we do measure this, and perhaps now's a good time to pivot to the second article by your buddy Robin Carhart Harris et al. And some of his other fellow academics.
Quickly interject the Qualia Research Institute. They're trying. They're looking really serious at how do we create really good neurosci models that can encompass all this stuff. So they're working on it, though I have my doubts about qualia being the right thing. Qualia are like the smallest unit of experience, I think, something like that. So trying to like atomize experience, which is interesting, but it's the logical next step given what neuroscientists are doing now. So I understand why they're doing it. I just don't necessarily know you're going to get there. But all right, next up.
Beautiful.
wellness.
So good segue. So this is an article by a team at Imperial College of London. So it's Kerry Manns, Hannes Kettner, David Arizzo, Eileen Hagen, and Mendel Kalin, and Robin Carhart-Harris. The title is Sustained Multifaceted Improvements in Mental Well-Being Following Psychedelic Experience in a Prospective Opportunity Sample. And the reason why this segues so well to what we were just talking about, we're talking about how do you measure psychedelic experiences, and how do we know whether someone has a helpful or good or significant psychedelic experience. And so we're moving away from the mystical experience to a concept of well-being that the Imperial College team uses here. And they actually have a naturalistic observational study with a comprehensive approach to assessing well-being before and after the taking of a psychedelic compound to induce a psychedelic experience. And so they have 14 different measures that they actually use, and they then do a multivariate analysis statistically of each of these 14 measures to see which has the most kind of validity. So those are the 14 measures that measure the person pre and then post use of psychedelics on one occasion. And they actually take their sample up to 2 years. Now, they only had 90 people, or about 64 people at the end of the 2 years, but they started off with 654 and then worked
Great
through.
sample set.
Yeah. And so they come up with this finding, 3 core kind of clusters of measures that seem to have some kind of statistical validity. That is being well, staying well, and spirituality. And the first 2 tended to be the more significant of the correlation there. So the being well and the staying well. And so what the article then goes on to do is build this kind of model of trying to understand what do we actually mean by real well-being? Like, what does it mean to be human and functioning well? And it's not just the absence of depression or the absence of wanting to kill ourselves or the absence of anxiety. Right. It's the presence of a lot of positive characteristics of meaning in our life and functioning well, and of really loving different aspects of our life, and having the people, the places, the things, the environment that we are kind of co-creating in our lived experience that aligns with some kind of deep meaning within us. And so it does touch upon that mystical experience, I think. What were some of your thoughts, Joe?
I just like that we're finally looking beyond kind of single variable stuff and trying to quantize this, because, from what I've seen, we've really wanted to focus on this drug for this indication. And it's great. It's a good starting point. Once we get beyond safety, we should be going there. But, how many new drugs coming out of the pharma pipeline have such a broad base of users in the wild before it's even approved by the FDA? This is a really exceptional case. And why are people using it so much? I have a friend who's struggling with drinking and used a single, probably like 0.1, 0.2 grams of mushrooms and a little bit of cannabis the other day. And they had this realization: I'm just so happy I don't need to drink anymore. It felt so good. Wow. And like, what is that? What is it about psilocybe cubensis and the various strains in cannabis that can make somebody feel so complete? And that's a really big question. And I'm just so happy that these people are, the researchers on this project are going down this new route, new conversation track. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see some really interesting progress. So, and I love this line about prophylactic value of psychedelic therapy. Like, how do we get people resiliency, boosting? I think it's a really big deal here. They use the term eudaimonia, which Kyle and I got really familiar with because we're getting included in a psychedelics and philosophy book, and had a look at the drug war and ethics and stuff. So we got back to we had to go all the way back to Aristotle, and Aristotle is eudaimonia, like good. And it was, we struggled with it for weeks. Like, what is he talking about? And it's this sweet spot balance between polis and self, like the good for the individual and good for the collective. And it's a sweet spot. So it's not easy to define. And that's similar to what they found here in this article. It's not really that easy to define this thing. And even in positive psychology, they're apparently having problems having a standard set of measures, or even an agreement on what wellness is or something. It's fascinating. Yeah. And they had 14 different measures.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And there was one that particularly stood out. I particularly like the name of this one because it's two lovely places I'm very familiar with the Warwick, Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. That seemed to have the most validity. But yeah, the fact they had 14 measures here of well-being, just brilliant, because that in itself says we don't really know how to measure human outcomes. And I'm trying to just not even use the word well-being. We don't even know what word to use. And it's not depression. It's not anxiety. And you were just talking about your friend that used, I think, psilocybin to help with his alcohol use disorder. You and me, Joe, are both big fans of the Awaken team in England, in Bristol. So Anthony Tennyson's the CEO, Ben Sessa, I think, is the chief medical officer, and David Nutt is on their board, and they're great professor. Big fan of David Nutt. So they did this amazing study looking at, I think, 90 people with alcohol use disorder. And I don't want to butcher the actual numbers, but what they found was, I think after 12 months, people had a number of psychedelic experiences, I think with MDMA maybe and ketamine, or two different cohorts perhaps, don't quite recall. And the remission rate, which means in addiction, those that didn't relapse, those that stayed in remission, that were sober, that were not going back onto the substance use path, was around 80%, I believe, kind of between 70 and 80%, I recall. And so what we normally find in addiction treatment is the remission rate from gold standard is around 20% after 12 months. 20% of people will still be in remission after 12 months of treatment. So this is phenomenal stuff. And it has a neurobiological benefit, the psychedelic pathway. It has a mystical benefit, but it also has this well-being benefit as well. And the article we're looking at talks about being well and staying well, and particularly they talk about being well, touching upon these having higher traits of optimism and having a positive affect and self-esteem. And then a second factors about staying well. They said it comes down to it builds resilience, psychological flexibility, and mindfulness. These are all heavily correlated in other psychological and neuropsych research to this general understanding of well-being. So this sounds like very, very powerful, but also somewhat anecdotal, naturalistic research that they developed here. But these are some very big guns at Imperial College. And I'm sure there'll be this is open research, open data set. So I'm sure there'll be other, findings that come into this. And one other thought I wanted to share just for right now, Joe, is, you and I have talking about this concept of wellness and well-being and wellness centers. And, it's kind of this word that is overused a little bit like mindfulness. But we're trying to put words to this thing. So we're trying to have this idea that psychedelics combined with psychotherapy, combined with integration that can have dance, music, friends, meditation, kind of nature, relatedness, all of this could be considered as wellness and well-being. And so what we do, we want to have wellness, well-being professionals, and that's us. We want to have wellness and well-being centers. And so that might be a clinic, or it might be a retreat center, or it might be an online, like what we do at Psychedelics today. But I really feel like let's stick with this concept for now until we find better words than wellness and well-being, because it does move us away from this pathologizing mentality towards something that somehow is a bit more spiritual and mystical and brings in things like massage and dance and bodywork. So that kind of somatic, trauma-informed understanding of wellness that's not just brain. So it moves us in the right direction. And I love what you brought in, Joe, about the prophylactic nature of this. We don't just do this when we've fallen off the precipice and we've got PTSD or we've got alcohol use disorder or we're suicidal. We actually do it as part of our wellness regime. Do stretching in the morning or eating well or talking to a therapist or taking a day off work because we're just overloaded. So psychedelics can be something that we actually find a way to integrate in a safe and responsible way, perhaps X number of times a year. And we have to be the mature adults to judge when that is and to know when we actually don't need it or when we do, or we need to maybe step up the gas on our other wellness routines as well.
Right. And, the healthier we are, the more resilient we are to catastrophic stuff. Like I remember something around muscle mass being correlated with increased muscle mass being correlated with better survivability and hospitalizations. So like we last longer in the hospital when we're healthier, is how I read that. And I think, the more tools we have, the more experience we have with this stuff. And what a better way to experience something that's kind of difficult without actually being in it. Like it's not a car accident, but you could live the car accident, or it's not being dismembered, but it's the experience of it. And that kind of better prepares you for more catastrophic things that can come down the pipe. And and just better connection with your loved ones in the world. That's great. That's really valuable. And not to mention, like, let's kind of heal some kind of subconcussive brain damage, or even concussive brain damage, if that turns out to be true, which I think it will. But let's heal that ahead of time so that we can be a little bit more cognitively on our toes as things come down the pipe. Yeah. So I think it's really great. I'm happy we're looking at it like this. And what did you think of this Roz Watts part? Oh,
yes. The article mentions other modalities, many other things other than psychedelics that can be components of, a comprehensive wellness, well-being regimen or a lifestyle or mindset. And so it mentioned mindfulness and ACT. So that is acceptance and commitment therapy. So Rosalind Watts, who's kind of from Imperial, I'm not sure if she's still there, and Synthesis, she's got a similar model called the ACE model, ACE, so acceptance, connection, and embodiment. And she uses this wonderful analogy, and she has a lovely meditation if you want to look it up. And when she's talking about, when one is going into a psychedelic experience, to set intentions, imagining one is going down kind of through the water and, down to the bottom of the pond, and perhaps at the bottom of the hand, you're kind of looking around and seeing what's there in the mud and, exploring and digging and moving things away. And there's an oyster or a clam, and inside that there's this pearl. And it takes some effort to get to that pearl, but once you find it, you kind of bring it towards yourself. You kind of inculcated it, you embody it, and then you take it back up to the surface with you to continue getting to know, to inculcate it, embody it into your sense of being, and to figure out how to use it in your day-to-day life, this pearl. So that accept, connect, and embody is that bringing the pearl, that value of our psychedelic journey or our kind of mystical experience into our real life. And so I think that's, mindfulness is great for that. The acceptance piece helps for the accepting of the things that have happened to us. So the trauma that we've experienced, Gabor Mate says trauma is not, it is something that's happened to us, and that we're kind of trying to pull the plug on it, still doing its thing to us actively. So it's still actually affecting us, like its ripple effect is still happening to us now. So we have to accept that and move through it. I love how they brought that in. There was one other thing I wanted to come back to that you were just talking about, Joe. I think you mentioned the word social capital. Did you? So
no, but go for it. Where you going?
Just on more of a meta level, I feel like a part of what we're talking about is how to understand the psychedelic experience and label it and kind of measure it. We're also trying to find an ecosystem that it fits within. And I feel like the term social capital is really important here. So I'm not sure how to define that, but it's a term I came through as a school kid in England. And there was an Italian guy, I think, that coined it. And he particularly was talking about the south of Italy and this idea in the Mezzogiorno, which is the word they're using for the south of Italy because of the intensity of the sunshine in the midday. So he found a way of analysing and measuring social capital in the south of Italy and realising that a lot of the happiness and the health in Italy, in the south of Italy, in I think it was the 50s and 60s perhaps, was because of the lifestyle that they developed, because it was hot, because it was agricultural. There was a lot of helping each other out, going through the harvest, the growing agricultural cycle year after year, elders and youth and rites of passage in that respect, eating together, healthy food, taking an afternoon nap, having, a sense of religion, spirituality, not being stressed and rushing around. That was social capital. So it was individual wellness, but it was manifest on a social collective level that is very much in opposition to what we now experience, which is of kind of dissocial capital in our contemporary Western society, where we're constantly rushing around. We're completely atomized and disconnected from the sense of community and of meaning and of spirituality and religion and of the past and of the future. So I think what we're needing to get right now to survive the next few hundred years is social capital, is this ability to place ourselves within this collective conscious that has meaning and that has a very, very powerful and precarious role to play right now on a precipice, ontologically speaking, for where humanity goes next. So coming back to social capital as the only way to solve this, and that could be through law and policy changes, but I feel like it happens deeper, more on a soul spirit level that psychedelics help us to tap into.
There's this piece that came out in 2011, very tangential. This guy named Ethan Roland of Appleseed Permaculture. Everybody knows I'm really into the permaculture idea, I hope by now. And this article on the 8 forms of capital and how not everything's money. So you've got, pull up the list here: intellectual capital, spiritual capital, social, material, financial, living, cultural, experiential. And that relates to different kinds of, currencies, things like connection, material resources, money, carbon, nitrogen, water, ideas, knowledge, action, prayer, intention, faith, and karma, song, story, and ritual. So there's so much more to it. Thinking exclusively in financial terms, kind of again, it's kind of like the reductionist thing that can happen in the sciences at times, and we've got to say this thing is a lot bigger, a lot more rich. There's a lot more depth than we can understand, or maybe do understand at this point. It's just a really big and interesting project. We've got underway here. And it seems critical to us, and that's kind of why a lot of us get at each other's throats. Things are scary. And, it's okay to be scared, but, let's maybe try to play nice in the sandbox in this really interesting project we've got going. We all think we're right. And, others might also be right or even more right than you, but how can those things exist in the same ecosystem? Can they?
Yeah, beautiful. I think if the more of us that come together and we are all right about certain parts of this, again, coming to IFS on a meta level, if we can all bring the pieces that we're right about and all be different to each other at the same time, I think we're going in the right direction. And you just mentioned the term reductionist. So the opposite of reductionist I looked it up, is holist, HOLIST. And so that's where the word holistic comes from. So we're looking for that holistic, that place that we've kind of gone so far away from. And I love permaculture as well, Joe. I didn't know you're into that. So that's great. Something we can develop a permaculture and Kabbalah.
I used to run a podcast, Permaculture Salad, actually, way back. Yeah.
Amazing.
You got to start somewhere.
Yeah. But that's looking at, social capital and changing the way that society works and functions on a very, nuts and bolts level, like water and soil quality and, inputs and outputs and trading and bartering as a community. it's not just spiritual internal experiences. It's real nuts and bolts. Like, how do we rebuild our society so that we, when the power goes out and when the big container ships from China stop coming, can we survive? So with permaculture, I believe we can.
Right. It's, making the next best use of things, taking a systems view. They teach it as gardening, but it's a design system that can be implemented anywhere. And it's a great way for understanding really complex social situations, invisible systems that are everywhere, like just because there's not a building, use a horrible example, selling racism, we've got a consumer packaged good of racism. Doesn't mean that racism isn't systemic. Like we can see it, but it's not like a tangible, like we can't always see it, but it's baked in all over. And what can we do to like see it better? Make the invisible systems visible and kind of be aware of those dynamics so that we can do better design.
Yeah.
Long term.
Yeah, because ultimately the way that we're living as a society is unsustainable, but it is invisibly kind of baked within the structure and, of the way that we live. So we've got to be able to see what it is first. So if, just a thought, if you listeners out there are interested in finding an intersection between permaculture and psychedelics, maybe Kabbalah and some of these mystical experiences, just let us know what your thoughts are. Because I think, I would love us to integrate more permaculture design courses and that kind of way of nuts and bolts. How do we live as a community, collectively? And we're talking about kind of social sharing of psychedelics to begin with. We spoke about kind of group work and these, internal subjective experiences. And we're talking about policy change. And so it's all interrelated. So let us know what you think. Joe, I've loved this one-on-one. Thank you for this pleasure.
It's been really fun. And if folks want to look into the backlog, the Piatiti Institute in Peru is doing permaculture and ayahuasca retreats. And you could do like a really massive retreat. Permaculture training is like 14 days. It's a lot of hours, but throwing in some shamanism and ayahuasca experiences and actually being in the jungle, some really good stuff there. Fan Rousseau was a South African gentleman I really like. He kind of was introducing us to the whole thing. And I've been talking to some people about this too, David. So there's some ideas in the works. David, this has been really fun. Yeah. This episode will come out Friday, the 23rd. So what do we want to pitch here? Oh yeah, we've got the Australian cohort coming up really soon, early August. That kicks off. So if you're in Australia or in one of those time zones, please come on down, join our more time zone appropriate training course, Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. And we've also got our next dates lined up on our sales page. So, come on down, check out what we've got, and we'd love to have you. Yeah, it's just a beautiful foundations course for helping you figure out where you want to go next, and stay tuned for some big announcements.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, we got a lot in the works. It's really awesome. All right. So thanks, David. And we'll see you on the next episode, everybody.
Take care, everyone. And big shout out to our friends Carl and Michelle. Get well soon, guys. Thanks a lot, Joe.